1660 Ti tests, and it's not going to be represented as we move along. So next we have 3D Mark TimeSpy Extreme, which is a DirectX 12 test, and here we can see where NVIDIA has made some real big gains when it comes to asynchronous compute performance. 1660 scores 2710 with a graphics score of 2502, which beats out the RX 590 by about 380 points and sort of sits right between that RX 590 score and the GTX 1660 Ti. Here's 3D Mark VR Mark Blue Room, which is a VR test. We have an average score as well as a frames per second score. The 1660 scored 1727, which handily beats out the RX 590, which comes in at 1355. And here also I'd like to point out the GTX 1060 6GB. If you got one of those a couple years ago and you're considering an upgrade, there's a pretty nice increase in performance here when you compare that to the 1660. Next is Ashes of the Singularity Escalation, also a DirectX 12 test. We're running at 2560 by 1440 here, and the GTX 1660 has 37.7 average frames per second, again beating out the RX 590 with 33.5, which had just barely beat out the 1066 gig with 33.4. If we move over to 1920 by 1080, the 1660 scores 42.7 average frames per second, again beating out the RX 590 with 38.7. Here's Shadow of the Tomb Raider, our last DirectX 12 test, and the GTX 1660 got 46 average frames per second, running at 2560 by 1440. RX 590 had a better performance here, but still wasn't able to beat it as it came in just 1 FPS short at 45. 1660 Ti had a nice lead here with 55 FPS. Of course, if you want the most performance out of any of these cards, you're going to have to go with the RTX 2060, but that costs $350. If we look at 1920 by 1080, the 1660 jumps up to 71 FPS on average and gains a little bit more of a lead over the RX 590, which had 66 frames per second. Here's GTA 5, which remains one of the top 10 games played on Steam, which is why I continue to run benchmarks of it at 2560 by 1440. We have 75 average frames per second for the GTX 1660, which is a very nice performance. If you're playing on a 1440 monitor and you're looking for about a 60 Hz refresh rate, I think that would be a pretty good experience for you. Of course, if you move over to 1920 by 1080, you can get more frames, 113 average frames per second for the 1660, beating out the RX 590 with 95, and coming in just between the RX 590 and the 1660 Ti. Here's Overwatch, and at 2560 by 1440 we have 95 average frames per second for the GTX 1660, again just edging out that RX 590, which came in at 92 FPS, and here again just a slight edge over the 1066 gig, so it's going to depend on which game you're playing when it comes to performance improvements over the last generation of cards. Some will have more of a gain than others. If we move over to 1920 by 1080, we have 143 average frames per second for the GTX 1660, 136 average FPS for the RX 590. Our final test is Metro Exodus, and this is also DirectX 12, so I guess I lied to you guys earlier, but point being that at 2560 by 1440 we have 31.9 average frames per second for the 1660, and bear in mind this is a very intense test, not necessarily representative of the performance you would get in-game. It's going to be lower FPS in the benchmark run than the game itself, so just bear that in mind. But here is an example of a game where the RX 590 is shining a bit more and actually beats out the 1660, 34.5 average frames per second, and here was where the RX 590 also gave the 1660 Ti the greatest run for its money. If we move over to 1920 by 1080, we see similar performance, 41.5 average frames per second for the 1660. The RX 590 beats it out with 44.6 average FPS, but the 1660 Ti beats them both with 45.3. So to sum up, the GTX 1660 provides a lot of gaming performance at 1080 or 1440, and it beats out the RX 590 in most of my tests. Not all of them, but most of them, just as the 1660 Ti did. So for $220, I think this will definitely be the new go-to graphics card for budget builds, and we'll have to see if AMD is going to respond with price drops for the RX 570, 580, or 590. If you're wondering why I didn't include the 570 or 580 in my benchmark results, one, I literally only had today to make this video, and two, if it's beaten the 590, it's going to beat the 570 and 580 as well. I only tested 3 variants of the 1660 today though, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot more out there with varying features and price ranges, some of them with RGB and stuff too, but who cares about that? We want performance, not aesthetics. But the end result is a very viable new GPU option for people who are looking to spend a little over $200 with notable gains versus the previous generation. If I have any complaints about the GTX 1660 other than the name, which I'm still complaining about, 1660 Ti and everything, it would be that I think NVIDIA could have launched these GPUs last year sometime, since right now we're looking at Turing, and Turing without RTX, which is what these cards have, is basically Volta, which should have launched like last year. But anyway, I'll post links to these cards in the video description below. Let me know in the comments if you're going to pick up a 1660. If you are, which one you might be interested in. And of course, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. We'll see you guys next time.
It really does look like NVIDIA cannot help themselves. So here we are, hot on the heels of the hilariously named GTX 1660 Ti, and they are telling, once again, the same 16 from the back, 60 from the front joke, with the release of the non-Ti version, the GTX 1660. But this is no laughing matter, because the GTX 1660 has a serious flaw that I believe AMD will be quick to exploit. Let's go ahead and explore that, shall we? With Glasswire, you can instantly see your current and past network activity, detect malware, and block badly behaving apps on your PC or Android device. Use offer code Linus and get 25% off at the link below. Like last month's GTX 1660 Ti, NVIDIA's new Turing card doesn't have a Founders Edition, so ours is an EVGA entry-level XC variant with this huge single fan but triple slot cooler. Don't worry though, compact PC enthusiasts, they will have a dual fan, dual slot variant as well. But enough about EVGA, let's talk about what NVIDIA did with the GTX 1660. Sorry, they did something with it, right? Yes, right. But considering that we're still dealing with the same TU116 GPU, the changes from the 1660 Ti are fairly minimal. We lose a few CUDA cores, we gain a bit of clock speed, so small stuff so far, but then we actually lose quite a bit of our memory bandwidth by stepping down to cheaper GDDR5 memory like last generation's GTX 1066 gig instead of the faster GDDR6 that's used by the 1660 Ti. That's not to say they haven't made some other tweaks though. So when we compare the CUDA cores and texture units, we're actually looking at a pretty big boost in performance on paper, despite the launch price sitting more in line with that confusingly named 3 gig variant of the 1060. But specs are only part of the equation, and the extra oomph that Turing brings to the table with simultaneous integer and floating point compute, along with its much larger cache, makes for a very interesting value proposition. Assuming, of course, that all of this holds up in the real world. Now, NVIDIA didn't seed these to reviewers directly, so since we have to make a video of it, we ended up a little bit late to the party, and we had to forego our Ryzen test bench as a result. With that said, we're not leaving AMD out in the cold here. The direct competitors to the GTX 1660 from Team Red are the RX 590 and RX 580. So we'll be comparing against those and the 1060 to see exactly how much more performance we've gained over the last card NVIDIA launched at this price. And as we have a look at our gaming results, yep, it does indeed absolutely cream the GTX 1060 across the board, with scores almost exactly in between the 1066 gig and the 1660 Ti. In fact, we're seeing results that are similar to, although in some cases a bit behind, the more expensive RX 590, which will be interesting later on when we come to our value comparison. For its part, the RX 580, well, doesn't win any races here, but it puts up a good fight, and its significantly lower price tag will also be interesting later on. Before that though, productivity. And it's here that things take a bit of a wild turn. The GTX 1660 performs better on short Blender renders, but then gets overtaken by even the lower priced RX 580 when it comes to longer ones. Then it gets mostly defeated when we look at Luxmark, and as for SpecView Perf, well, it can't seem to make up its mind. As with the 1660 Ti, Team Red and Team Green trade blows depending on each individual workload, although sometimes the performance gap can widen into a gulf, such as in CATIA and SolidWorks. Now, as with the TI variant, because there isn't a reference design for the 1660's cooler, there's not necessarily much point in discussing the exact numbers that we measured with this card, but in a broad sense, we can see that it doesn't output a ton of heat, and we can see that EVGA's overbuilt cooler does definitely perform, and it's a nice to have since this card is priced the same as a reference design would be. Now, onto power consumption. Compared to the 1660 Ti, power consumption at idle is down, but under load is actually up. And that might seem kind of unintuitive, but it's actually because of the higher voltage requirements for the less efficient GDDR5 memory that powers the non-TI card. So overall, power consumption, as measured at the PCI Express power cable, is not looking too great, even higher than the GTX 1060 6GB. But bear in mind that the slot might be providing varying levels of power to these cards. Frankly though, power consumption isn't a huge concern to us at this TDP anyway, so it's on to what is a concern: value. If we look at the 1660 from purely an upgrader's point of view, like if you've already got the rest of your computer, then just like its bigger brother, it ends up looking pretty good. However, when we look at it from the perspective of someone putting together a brand new build, AMD actually runs away with the show thanks to the RX 580's lower price tag and the RX 590's higher performance. And this is true all the way up the budget range, where the only time the 1660 makes any sense is when compared to the previous generation 1060 from NVIDIA themselves. So that is where the fatal flaw that I alluded to before comes in. There's nothing actually wrong with the GTX 1660, and it's still got the usual green NVIDIA goodness that you'd expect, like GeForce Experience if you're into that, and their excellent NVENC H.264 video encoder. It's just that it's hard to build a strictly gaming performance argument for choosing this over a competing option from Team Red. In fact, the 1660 has even more narrow of a value proposition than the Ti, and that's a bad thing when you consider that the 1660 Ti's value prop against the RTX 2060 was already pretty low, again, unless you're upgrading. So it really feels like the GTX 1660 is specifically targeted towards anyone who would have already been interested in the GTX 1060, which I guess if you're only competing against yourself, then that's fair. But to be a clear choice over AMD, remember, this is a GTX, not an RTX, so there's no ray tracing sort of like extra X factor value to it. So we think the extra money spent on this fancy 3-slot cooler might have been better utilized to hit a more aggressive price point. At $209, it would be looking better, and at $199, it'd be really competitive. But at this price, especially the OC versions, blah. The RX 500 series is simply eating NVIDIA's lunch in this price bracket. Massdrop is featuring the Massdrop X Hi-Fi Man HE4XX planar magnetic headphones. So Hi-Fi Man, if you haven't heard of them before, was established back in 2007 and made a name for themselves